Comedy. A play, movie, etc. of light and humorous character with a cheerful ending. The branch of drama concerned with this form of composition. The comic element of drama, of literature generally, or of life. Any comic or humorous incident or series of incidents. Well, I promised you a video on comedy. Please don't expect too much. I'm having camera problems. I'm back to the camera that's held together with a piece of tape. The two subsequent cameras that I purchased later both froze up. My good old standby that's held together with tape is still working. Let's knock on wood. I know there's wood around here somewhere. I think this table has some wood in it. Anyway. Yeah, there's types of comedy like dark comedy, usually it's grim or satiric. There's farce, broad satire and improbable situations. High comedy, sophisticated, often satirizing genteel society, and a lot of, well, like Eddie Izzard's one of those. It's very intellectual, and there are quite a few, there's a handful of comics that I could think of that deal with, you have to know what he's talking about, otherwise it's not funny. It's not just something that every person on the street knows. Low comedy is characterized by slapstick and burlesque. In the olden days, the turn of the 1900, 1910, those days, they had vaudeville in the United States. I think they have music hall in England. They had vaudeville and burlesque. Vaudeville was usually family friendly, and you could go and get entertainment. There's singing and acting and little scenes and dog shows, dogs dancing around, and maybe some comedians and a magic trick or something like that. And then there was burlesque, which was basically women in their underwear with a lot of sexual innuendos and everything. Now, depended upon exactly where the burlesque was, how racy they could get. But then we have slapstick comedy, very boisterous. A lot of things going on, chasing and running into stuff, things hitting them, practical jokes, getting hit with objects like a man picks up a ladder and he turns and the guy behind him gets hit with the ladder accidentally, that kind of things. Slipping on a banana peel. Things that, and comedy is not pretty. And Steve Martin said that in one of his, well, I don't have it right now, an album of his comedy. The one where he comes out with the "excuse me." This was talking 1976, something like that. Anyway, he says comedy isn't pretty. And that's true. Comedy comes from a lot of unfortunate circumstances generally, like growing up in a bad neighborhood. The things maybe your mother tells you when you're going to the grocery store, she knows you can't afford anything, so she gives you a big spiel on what you can and cannot do when you get in that grocery store. And there's a comedian, Lavelle Crawford, that has a whole spiel on that I just roll in the aisles listening to him. Situation comedies, usually awkward and uncomfortable. And then you have visual versus vocal. Yes, I got my list. Visual versus vocal. Even in silent movie days, there was slipping on a banana peel, bonking into stuff, running into things, being hit by things. Buster Keaton, he was also in movies after the talkies, but Buster Keaton was one of the best. He was like a physical comic. Like a building could fall down and he happened to be standing in an area where the window would be. So the whole building falls down around him except he's standing there and he doesn't get touched because he's standing in the opening of the window. In France they had Jacques Tati. He was like a physical comedian. Mr. Bean, played by Rowan Atkinson, basically is a tribute to Jacques Tati. And I hope I'm pronouncing it right. I don't speak French. In this country, in the United States, we had Three Stooges, Laurel and Hardy, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, which I know they have seen in Italy because they call him Sanio e Olio. The Marx Brothers. And there were other groups besides the Marx Brothers in those days, in the 1940s, 30s and 40s. But the Marx Brothers were probably some of the best. They did a lot of sarcasm and wit and wordplay, and there was also a lot of moving around and almost running into stuff. A lot of physical and verbal comedy. They were like both. They had several movies, a lot of snarky sarcasm. And then we have club comedians. Back in the 50s, 1950s, is when most of the nightclub comedians at the 40s and 50s really came into their own. And in the United States, on the East Coast, they had the Adirondack, is it the Adirondack Mountains? I forget. The Catskills. There were a lot of clubs up in there where people would go for the weekend or whatever, and they had a lot of entertainers up there. This is, I think, before Las Vegas was built and established. And there were a lot of stand-up comedians, a whole lot. And a lot of them were, they call it the Borscht Belt because a lot of them were Russian or Russian Jewish heritage. And there's just too many to mention, because if I start listing them off, then I'm going to miss somebody. I know I will. Rodney Dangerfield, he was a one-liner, so was Stephen Wright. Oh, he's more new. Tommy Cooper in Britain, they were one-liner comedians where their whole joke consisted of like a sentence. Like the beginning and ending thought. It was funny. In the 50s you had, you had Mort Saul and there's just so many. Now my mind's going blank. In England there's a whole lot too. Working Man's Club is what they call it over there. Like Bernard Manning, he's what they call a blue comic, which is pretty nasty. He says either racist, bigoted, or nasty, dirty, sexy innuendo, or right blatantly out sexual. I mean, there were a lot of comedians like that in these clubs at that time. And yeah, then they had teams comedians like Abbott and Costello. They did a lot of wordplay. One guy was the straight man and one guy was the comedic. Bud Abbott was the straight man. He would say something, and Lou Costello was the comedic, and he's like, he didn't understand what Bud said, so he would say, "Do you mean this?" And then it would go off on some weird tangent. And usually very quick-paced. And like I said, the teams, there was Stan and Ollie, and then Jerry Stiller and Ann Mara. Stiller and Mara. Yes, that's Ben's mom and dad. I used to love to watch them. They were very funny. They had like a lot of kind of dry, sarcastic wit. And there was Jack Burns and Avery Schreiber. Burns and Schreiber, they did a lot of very fast talking routines. Dudley Moore and Peter Cook. Now we're getting into like the 60s and 70s. And there's a lot of comedians that probably most people on here watching this would have no clue who I'm talking about. I've actually met at least 2 comedians. Have I met more than that? I met Rich Hall when he was starting out in the 70s. He came up to the junior college where I was attending, and he was looking for a place to do his thing. So I went in and okayed it with because I was in student council, and I went in and okayed it with the dean. Then he performed in the square, and I took pictures, which I have. They're black and white pictures, and if I show them on here, they look blurry. But he did the Bolivian Killer Weed review, and I still remember his review, and I still remember his comedy. And I also met John Panette, who's passed. He was funny. He's, "I say nay nay," and go to the all-you-can-eat buffet. "You've been here 4 hours. You go now. You go now." Yeah. John Candy. I haven't met him, but he was one of my favorites. He was from Canada. And you have subsets. You've got women like Wanda Sykes, Ellen DeGeneres, Kathleen Madigan, who's from St. Louis, actually from around here. We're not far from here, about 5 miles from this house. Phyllis Diller, Moms Mabley, and Whoopi Goldberg. You have Hispanic comedians like Carlos Mencia and Gabriel Iglesias, otherwise known as Fluffy. Black comedians, lots and lots of black comedians. Lavelle Crawford, that cracks me up. He's from St. Louis, and Dick Gregory's from St. Louis. Red Fox is from around this neck of the woods too, I think. Richard Pryor, Dave Chappelle, Sinbad, Trevor Noah. Just a whole lot. There are more than I can even list. Even if I wrote it down, I would have several pieces of paper this big with all their names, everyone's name on it. They have musical comedians. Robert Klein was a musical comedian. Steve Martin is a musical comedian as well. In England, they've got Tim Minchin and Bill Bailey. They're musical comedians. Impressionists, and you have people that get up and impersonate people. So there's lots of different kinds of comedy. And usually when I am interested in auditioning for something, it's comedic. Oh goodness, I have 11 minutes of blither. Ooh. I hope I said something that someone might take as information. Upward and onward.